The first time Dorothy Bell put a rifle to her shoulder and aimed it at a man's chest, her hands did not shake, and that was the thing Silas Crane would remember about her for the rest of his days. It was the spring of 1878, and the grass along Larkspur Creek in the Wyoming Territory had come up green and thick after a wet winter, the kind of grass that made cattlemen dream and homesteaders pray. Dorothy stood on the porch of the ranch house her father had built with his own hands 12 years before, and she watched 4 riders come up the wagon road with the sun behind them, throwing their shadows long and crooked across the yard. She knew who led them before she could see his face. Nobody else in the territory sat a horse like Silas Crane did, like the whole world owed him the road he rode on. "Miss Bell," Crane called out, reining his horse to a stop just short of the fence line, close enough that she could see the oiled shine of his black coat and the gold watch chain looped across his vest. "I trust you have given more thought to my offer." "I gave it the thought it deserved the first time you made it," Dorothy said, which was none at all. Behind her, the screen door creaked, and old Pete Ruiz stepped out onto the porch with the shotgun that had belonged to Dorothy's father, holding it easy across his forearm, the way a man holds something he does not want to use, but will if he must. Pete had worked the Bell land since before Dorothy was born, had taught her to ride and to shoot, and to read the sky for weather. And in the 2 years since her father had died of the fever that took him in a single terrible week, Pete had been the only thing standing between Dorothy and a world that seemed determined to convince a young woman she could not hold ground alone. Crane's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. He was a broad man of perhaps 45 years, handsome in the way that money makes a man handsome, with silver threading through his dark hair at the temples and eyes the pale gray of a winter sky. He owned, by that spring, some 40,000 acres of grazing land stretching from the Wind River foothills to the edge of the Bell property, and he owned, too, the bank in Larkspur and the mercantile, and 3 of the 5 members of the Territorial Land Office, though that last fact was not yet known to anyone but himself and the men he paid. What he did not own, and what stood between his herds and the only reliable water in 20 miles during the dry months, was the quarter section of land beneath Dorothy Bell's boots. "You are a woman alone, Miss Bell," Crane said, and his horse shifted beneath him, sensing something in its rider that the animal did not like. "Your father is 2 years in his grave. You have no husband, no brothers, nothing but this old man and a handful of horses. I am offering you a fair price, more than fair, and passage back east if you wish it, or a comfortable room above my own hotel in town if you do not." "I am not alone," Dorothy said. "I have this land, and I have my father's grave on that hill yonder, and I have every intention of dying on this property an old woman surrounded by grandchildren, Mr. Crane, and not one day sooner. Now get off my land before I count to 3. You will not shoot me, Miss Bell. I did not say I would shoot you. I said get off my land." She let the rifle rise another inch, just enough that the morning light caught along the barrel. 1. Crane's jaw tightened. One of his riders, a broad-shouldered man with a scarred lip named Dutch Hobbs, reached toward his own sidearm, and Dorothy swung the rifle to cover him instead, quick as a snake striking. "You'll want to think twice about that," she said, and her voice did not rise, did not crack, stayed as level as creek water running over stone. 2. Miss Bell. 3. Nobody moved for the space of 3 long heartbeats, and then Crane laughed, a short humorless bark, and pulled his horse's head around. "You'll change your mind," he said over his shoulder. "Women always do, once they understand what it costs to be stubborn." "You'll never break me," Dorothy Bell called after him, and the words rang out clear across the yard, over the fence posts and the new grass and the creek running silver in the distance. "Not today, not next week, not ever. And you would do well to remember, I do not offer that particular warning twice." The 4 riders went back down the wagon road at a trot that was not quite a retreat, but was not far from it either, and Dorothy stood on the porch with the rifle still raised, until they had crossed the low rise a half-mile off and dropped out of sight. Only then did her shoulders come down, and only then did Pete Ruiz let out a long breath through his teeth. "He is not a man who forgets an insult, Miss Dorothy," Pete said quietly. "No," Dorothy agreed, "but he is a man who has never once in his life had a woman stand up to him and mean it. Let him chew on that a while." She did not know it then, standing on that porch with the smell of gunpowder still faint in the morning air, that within the week a stranger would ride onto her land with nothing but a tired horse and a rifle of his own, and that the course of her whole life would bend around him the way a river bends around a stone that will not move. She only knew that she was tired and frightened in a way she would never have admitted aloud, and that the sun was climbing and there were horses to feed and a fence line to mend before nightfall, because the land did not care about land barons or threats. The land only cared whether you showed up to tend it, day after day, whether your hands shook or not. Charles Abbott had been riding for the better part of 6 weeks when he crossed into the Wyoming Territory, and he had long since stopped counting the miles because counting them only reminded him how far he had come from Kansas and how little waited for him at either end of the journey. He was 29 years old, lean from the road and browned by a sun that did not care whether a man wanted its attention or not, and he carried with him a cavalry saber that had not left its scabbard in 3 years, a Henry repeating rifle he kept clean out of habit more than affection, and a grief he had not yet learned to set down. He had served with the Kansas cavalry in the last years of the war, had come home in 1865 to find his father's homestead outside of Lawrence still standing, had spent a decade building it back up with his own 2 hands only to watch a railroad man and the bank he owned strip it away from him through a foreclosure so tangled in fine print that Charles had not understood. He'd lost everything until the sheriff came to nail the notice to his own front door. His father had died of a broken heart, or so the doctor called it, though Charles knew heartbreak alone did not stop a man's lungs from working. Grief simply made him stop fighting for the next breath. His mother had gone to live with her sister in St. Louis, and Charles had put what little remained of his life onto the back of a good horse and ridden west, because west was the only direction that did not remind him of what he had lost. He had heard of Larkspur from a drover in Cheyenne who said there was good grazing land up that way, and work to be had for a man handy with horses and not too particular about who he worked for. Charles had ridden into the town on a Thursday afternoon with dust caked into every seam of his clothing, and had gone first to the livery to see his horse fed and rubbed down before he thought of his own supper, which was a habit that told anyone paying attention exactly what kind of man Charles Abbott was. It was at the livery that he first heard the name Dorothy Bell. "She held off Crane's men with a rifle not 5 days back," the liveryman said, a heavy-set fellow named Otis who talked while he worked without ever slowing his hands. Whole town still buzzing about it. Silas Crane wanting her water rights, and her standing on her own porch telling him to get off her land like she was talking to a dog that had wandered into her garden. "Crane," Charles repeated. "The land baron. The only one we've got, and one's plenty. Owns half this territory or wants to. Been squeezing the small outfits for 2 years now, buying up water rights and grazing leases till a man can't hardly run 50 head without paying Crane for the privilege of drinking his own creek water." Otis spat to the side. "Dorothy Bell's spread sits right on the best stretch of Larkspur Creek for 10 miles either direction. Crane wants it bad. She won't sell." "Good for her," Charles said, and meant it more than the words let on. "Good for her until Crane stops asking polite," Otis said, and there was something grim in the way he said it that stayed with Charles long after he'd left the livery. Charles Abbott was not a man who went looking for trouble, but he had spent enough years watching powerful men take what they wanted from people who could not defend themselves that something in him had gone hard and unwilling to look away from it any longer. He told himself, walking down the dusty main street of Larkspur toward the mercantile to buy a few provisions, that he was only curious, that a man riding through a strange town naturally wanted to know its business. He told himself that even as some part of him, the part that had not entirely given up on the idea of purpose, turned his feet toward the edge of town and the road that led out to the Bell Ranch, 3 miles distant, where a woman he had never met was fighting a war she could not win alone. He arrived at the Bell property just after 4 in the afternoon, and the first thing he saw was smoke. Not the gray smoke of a chimney fire, but the black, oily smoke of something burning that should not be burning, rolling up from a hay barn set 50 yards from the main house. Charles put his heels to his tired horse without a second thought and came up the wagon road at a gallop, and as he closed the distance, he saw the shapes of men, 3 of them, moving away from the barn on horseback at a run, and a woman standing alone in the yard with a bucket in each hand, running toward the fire, though there was no possible way 2 buckets of well water were going to save that barn. Charles swung down before his horse had fully stopped and caught the woman by the arm before she reached the flames. "That barn's gone," he said. "You go in there, you're gone with it. There are horses in there." Dorothy Bell wrenched her arm free, and even in the chaos of the moment, even with smoke stinging her eyes and her hair coming loose from its pins, Charles saw the fury blazing in her face and thought, distantly, that he had never in his life seen a person look so thoroughly unwilling to be stopped. "Then we get the horses," Charles said, "but you are not walking into a burning building with 2 buckets of water, ma'am. That is not saving anything." He was already moving toward the barn doors, already pulling his bandana up over his mouth and nose. "Which stalls?" "4 on the left side, nearest the door. There's still time." Dorothy was coughing now, the smoke thickening, but she followed him anyway, matching his pace step for step, and Charles understood in that instant that this was not a woman who was going to stay back and wait no matter what he told her. They went in together, low, under the worst of the smoke, and the horses were screaming in their stalls, wild-eyed and half-mad with fear, and Charles worked the first latch while Dorothy worked the second, and between them they got 4 horses loose, and driving out into the yard before the roof beams began to groan overhead in a way that told both of them, without needing words, that it was time to leave. They stumbled out into the yard together, Charles's hand at Dorothy's back guiding her the last few steps clear of the doorway, and not 30 seconds later the roof came down in a great collapsing roar and a fountain of sparks that rose up against the darkening sky. Dorothy Bell stood in her own yard, soot-streaked and breathing hard, watching her father's barn burn to the ground, and Charles Abbott stood beside her, a stranger she had known for perhaps 4 minutes, and neither of them said anything for a long while because there was nothing adequate to say. "Pete," Dorothy finally called out, her voice cracking with smoke and fear. "Pete, where are you?" "Here, Miss Dorothy." The old ranch hand came limping around the side of the house, one hand pressed to a bloodied gash above his ear. "They come up sudden, 3 of them hit me from behind before I even heard the horses. I am sorry, I could not stop them, I could not. You're hurt." Dorothy was at his side in an instant, all the iron in her voice gone soft with worry. "Sit down, let me look at that." "The barn matters more than my thick skull," Pete said, but he sat anyway on the edge of the porch steps, while Dorothy examined the wound with careful, quick fingers. Charles stood a little apart, watching the fire burn down to embers, and it was several minutes before Dorothy Bell turned to look at him properly, as if only now remembering that a stranger had ridden in out of nowhere and helped her save 4 horses from a burning barn. "I don't believe I caught your name," she said. "Charles Abbott, ma'am. You rode up on my land in the middle of an attack and ran into a burning barn beside me without so much as introducing yourself first. Didn't seem like the moment for manners." Something flickered at the corner of Dorothy's mouth, not quite a smile, but close to one, the first softening he had seen in her since he'd pulled her back from the flames. "No," she agreed. "I suppose it wasn't." She looked at him a moment longer, taking his measure the way a person does who has learned the hard way not to trust too quickly. "Thank you, Mr. Abbott. That barn was not worth your life, but the horses were, and I am grateful." "Wasn't nothing," Charles said, though it had been something and they both knew it. "Are you passing through, Mr. Abbott, or looking for work?" "Looking for work," Charles said, "though I'll admit I didn't expect the interview to include a fire." This time the almost smile became a real one, brief and tired but real, and Dorothy Bell wiped a smear of soot from her cheek with the back of her wrist and said, "Well, if you can handle a burning barn on your first afternoon, Mr. Abbott, I expect you can handle mending fence and breaking horses without too much trouble. The pay isn't much. Room in the bunkhouse, meals, and $8 a month, same as I paid the man who left last winter for better wages in Cheyenne. But I'll tell you plain, since you already know it anyway. The man who did this is not finished, and anyone who works this land is going to be standing in the same fire I am." Charles looked at the smoking ruin of the barn, at the old man with blood drying on his temple, at the woman before him who had run toward a burning building for the sake of 4 horses and had not once, in all the chaos, thought to save herself first. "I've stood in worse fires than this one," he said. "I'll take the job, Miss Bell." "Dorothy," she said, "if you're going to run into burning buildings with me, Mr. Abbott, you may as well use my first name." "Charles, then," he said, and something passed between them in that moment, quiet and unspoken, a recognition of 2 people who had both lost things they loved to men with more money than conscience, and who had both decided, separately and for their own reasons, that they were done losing. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that Charles had not expected to find comforting, but did. He rose before dawn to see to the horses, worked alongside Pete, rebuilding the barn plank by plank with lumber hauled up from the sawmill in town, and in the evenings he sat at the long table in the ranch house kitchen and ate whatever Dorothy had cooked, usually beans and salt pork and biscuits that improved steadily in quality as the weeks went on, since Dorothy readily admitted she had learned to cook only out of necessity after her mother passed when she was 16 years old. "My mother could make a Sunday dinner out of nothing but flour and hope," Dorothy told him one evening in early June, as they sat on the porch after supper watching the last light drain out of the sky over the western ridge. "I never did learn her trick for it. My biscuits used to come out hard enough to shingle a roof." "These are good biscuits," Charles said, and meant it. "You're a terrible liar, Charles Abbott." "I'm an honest man who happens to have gone hungry more than once in his life, and hunger improves the flavor of most everything." Dorothy laughed at that, a real laugh, unguarded, and Charles found he liked the sound of it more than he was entirely prepared to admit to himself. In the 6 weeks since he'd ridden onto her land, he had learned a great deal about Dorothy Bell that the town gossip in Larkspur had not told him. He had learned that her father, Thomas Bell, had come out from Ohio in 1866 with nothing but a wagon and a young wife and a baby daughter, and had built the ranch out of raw prairie through sheer stubborn labor, the same stubbornness that now lived on in his daughter like a second heartbeat. He had learned that Dorothy's mother had died of consumption when Dorothy was 16, and that Dorothy had kept house for her father and worked the ranch alongside him from that day forward, learning to ride and rope and shoot as well as any man in the territory, because there had been no one else to do it. He had learned that Thomas Bell had died 2 years back of a fever that swept through the county one terrible winter, and that Dorothy had buried him on the hill behind the house, beside her mother, and had not once considered selling the land to anyone, least of all Silas Crane, no matter how many times he came calling with his fine coat and his false smile and his increasingly ugly threats. And Dorothy, in turn, had learned about Charles. She had learned about the Kansas farm, about the railroad man and the bank that had taken it, about his father's death and his mother gone too soon. Louis, about the war years he did not speak of easily, but which had left their mark on him in the careful way he watched every room he entered, the way his hand found the grip of a weapon before his mind had even registered danger. She had learned that he was a man who kept his promises, who worked from Kansas to Kansas without complaint, and who had, in 6 short weeks, become someone she found herself watching for at the end of each day without quite admitting to herself why. "Do you ever think of going back?" Dorothy asked him one evening. "To Kansas, I mean, trying to get the farm back or start fresh somewhere near your mother." Charles considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I used to think about it every day. Now I think about it maybe once a week. There's nothing there for me anymore, Dorothy. The land's not mine, the house is likely fallen in by now, and my mother's got her sister's family around her. She doesn't need me hanging about reminding her of what we lost." He turned to look at her, and in the fading light his eyes were very steady. "I think a man can spend his whole life mourning a place, or he can go looking for a new one. I'd rather go looking." "And have you found it?" Dorothy asked, quieter now. "A new place?" Charles did not answer right away, and the silence between them stretched out comfortable and warm, filled with the sound of crickets starting up in the grass and a horse shifting in the corral. And finally he said, "I think I might be getting close." And Dorothy did not ask him to explain further, because some part of her already understood, and some part of her had been hoping he would say exactly that. It was not all quiet evenings and growing affection, though. Silas Crane had not forgotten the humiliation of being ordered off Dorothy Bell's land at Rifle Point, and the burned barn had been, as Dorothy predicted, only the opening move in a longer and uglier campaign. Through the summer months, Crane's pressure came in a dozen small cruelties. He convinced the bank, which he owned outright, to call in a note Dorothy's father had taken years before against a bad drought season, a note Dorothy had been paying down faithfully, but which Crane now demanded be settled in full within 60 days. He sent men to loiter at the edge of her property line, doing nothing illegal, simply watching, letting her feel the weight of being observed at all hours. He spread word through Larkspur that anyone who sold supplies to the Bell Ranch, or hired on to work it, would find their own business dealings with Crane's bank and mercantile suddenly, mysteriously difficult. "He is trying to starve you out," Charles said one evening in July, after Otis the liveryman had quietly warned Charles that Crane had been asking pointed questions about who was buying feed and nails on the Bell account. "Slow and legal, instead of fast and criminal, but starving you out all the same." "Then we will simply have to be harder to starve than he expects," Dorothy said, though the worry was plain on her face, and Charles saw it and hated Silas Crane a little more for putting it there. They found ways around it. Pete Ruiz had a cousin in the next county who ran cattle and was happy to trade feed and supplies without ever going near Crane's mercantile. Charles rode 2 days to Cheyenne to purchase what could not be gotten locally, paying with the small savings he had carried west with him, money he had been keeping against some unknown future need, and which he now spent without a second thought because the need standing in front of him mattered more than any need he might imagine later. Dorothy protested when she learned what he'd done, protested that she could not ask him to spend his own wages defending her land, and Charles had looked at her with an expression so plain and unguarded that she stopped arguing. "I'm not defending your land, Dorothy," he said. "I'm defending something I've come to care about a great deal, and if that happens to be your land, and you, then I don't see the use in pretending otherwise." It was the closest either of them had come to speaking plainly about what had grown between them, and after he said it, a silence fell over the kitchen where they stood, thick with everything neither of them had yet found the courage to say outright. Dorothy set down the coffee cup she'd been holding, and Charles watched her hands, watched the way they trembled slightly, and understood that this was a woman who had spent 2 years being strong for everyone around her and had very nearly forgotten what it felt like to let someone else be strong for her, even for a moment. "Charles," she said softly. "You don't have to say anything," he told her. "I didn't say it to put you on the spot. I said it because it's true, and I thought you ought to know it, whatever you decide to do with the knowing." Dorothy crossed the small kitchen, and before either of them quite understood what was happening, she had taken his face in both her hands and kissed him, soft and brief and searching, and when she pulled back her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears but stood very close to them. "I have been afraid to want anything for myself since my father died," she said. afraid that wanting things makes a person weak, makes them easier to break. But I do not think you make me weaker, Charles Abbott. I think you make me feel like I could stand against the whole world and not be alone in it." She laughed, a small, startled sound, as if surprised by her own honesty. "I'm not entirely certain what to do with that feeling." "You don't have to know what to do with it tonight," Charles said, and pulled her into an embrace that felt, to both of them, like the first solid ground either had stood on in a very long time. "We've got time." But time, as it happened, was the one thing Silas Crane had no intention of giving them. August came dry and hot, the kind of heat that turned the grass brittle and made every creek in the territory run low and precious. And it was in the second week of August that Silas Crane called on Dorothy Bell one last time, riding up to the ranch house alone this time, without Dutch Hobbs or any of his other men, which should have been the first sign that something had shifted in his calculations. "Miss Bell," he said, dismounting in the yard, his hat in his hands in a show of courtesy that fooled no one. "I have come to make you one final offer, and I would ask that you hear me through before you answer." Charles, who had been mending a section of the corral fence within easy earshot, straightened slowly and set down his hammer, watching. "Say what you came to say, Mr. Crane," Dorothy said, standing on the porch with her arms crossed. "The bank note on this property comes due in 3 weeks' time," Crane said. "I know it, you know it, and we both know you have not managed to raise the full sum, not with feed prices what they are in half the county, too afraid of me to do business with you openly. I am prepared to forgive that note entirely, wipe it clean, and pay you besides a sum of $4,000 for this land, which is more than double its worth to any reasonable buyer. You could take that money and build a new life anywhere in this country you chose, Miss Bell. Nobody would think less of you for it. A woman alone, holding out against forces greater than herself, there is no shame in knowing when to yield." "There would be shame in it for me," Dorothy said. "This is my father's land and my mother's grave is on that hill, and I have told you before and I will tell you again. I am not selling, Mr. Crane, not for $4,000, not for $40,000. Not for any sum you could name." Crane's expression did not change, but something in his eyes went cold and flat, and Charles, watching from the fence line, felt the hair rise on the back of his neck the way it used to before an ambush in the war, that animal sense of danger arriving before the mind could name it. "You are making a grave error," Crane said quietly. "I am making the only choice that lets me sleep at night," Dorothy said. "Now, as I have told you before, get off my land." Crane looked past her to Charles standing at the fence line, and something like recognition crossed his face, the recognition of a man cataloging an obstacle he had not previously accounted for. "Your new hired man," Crane said. "The war veteran from Kansas. I hear he has taken quite an interest in your affairs, Miss Bell. I wonder if he understands what he has ridden into." "He understands better than most," Dorothy said. "Now go before I count to 3, same as always." Crane mounted his horse without another word, but as he turned to ride away, he looked back once more, and this time his gaze found Charles directly. "You should have kept riding, Mr. Abbott," he said. "There was nothing for you here worth the trouble that is coming." "I've found plenty worth the trouble," Charles said evenly, "and I don't scare as easy as you might hope." Crane's mouth twisted into something that was almost admiration, though it curdled quickly into something harder, and he rode off down the wagon road without another word, and both Dorothy and Charles stood watching him go with the certain knowledge that whatever came next would not be small and would not be gentle. It came 11 days later, in the dead of night. Charles woke to the sound of horses moving fast in the dark, more horses than any legitimate visitor would bring at that hour, and he was up off his bunk in the small room he occupied at the back of the house, rifle in hand, before the first shout went up from outside. He burst through the kitchen just as Dorothy came down the stairs in her nightdress with her father's old Colt revolver already in her hand, and Pete Ruiz came stumbling out of the bunkhouse across the yard with his shotgun, and between the 3 of them, they had perhaps 90 seconds of warning before the first torch arced through the darkness and struck the side of the tool shed, catching the dry wood immediately. "They mean to burn us out entirely this time," Dorothy said, her voice tight but steady, and Charles saw in the growing firelight perhaps 6 riders circling the property, more men than Crane had ever sent before, and understood that this was not a warning any longer. This was meant to be the end. "Get to the well," Charles said. "We need water on that shed before it spreads to the house." But even as he said it, a rifle shot cracked out of the darkness, splintering the porch post beside Dorothy's shoulder, and she dropped low with a gasp, and Charles's blood went cold with a fear more absolute than anything he had felt in the war, because in the war he had only ever feared for himself, and this fear was for someone else entirely, someone whose safety mattered more to him than his own. "Dorothy!" he shouted, and she called back, I'm all right, get down." And he did, dropping behind the porch rail and returning fire toward the muzzle flash he'd seen in the dark, and for a long, terrible stretch of minutes, the night dissolved into chaos, gunfire and shouting, and the crackle of flames spreading from the tool shed toward the edge of the house itself. It was Pete Ruiz who saved them, in the end, or rather Pete Ruiz's decade of watching this land and knowing every rise and hollow of it in the dark. He had slipped around behind the riders in the confusion and fired both barrels of his shotgun into the air, close enough to 2 of the horses that the animals bolted in panic, throwing their riders and scattering the attack into disorganized retreat. Charles, seeing the opening, put 3 quick shots into the dirt near the feet of the nearest horseman, close enough to make the point without aiming to kill, and the man wheeled his mount and fled, and one by one the others followed, until the yard fell quiet again except for the crackle of the burning shed and the ragged sound of 3 people breathing hard in the aftermath of terror. "Is anyone hit?" Charles called out, scrambling to his feet, and when Dorothy did not answer immediately his heart seized in his chest until he saw her rise from behind the porch rail, unhurt but shaking badly, and he crossed the yard and pulled her into his arms without thinking, and she clung to him just as fiercely, both of them trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. "I'm all right," she said again, into his shoulder this time, her voice smaller than he had ever heard it. "I'm all right, Charles." "I thought that first shot had taken you," he said, and his voice cracked on the words in a way that told her, more clearly than any declaration could have, exactly how much he had come to love her in the months since he'd ridden onto her land. "I have never in my life been so afraid." "I am not so easy to lose," Dorothy said, pulling back just enough to look up at him, her face lit orange by the dying flames of the shed, streaked with soot and tears she had not noticed falling. "But I confess I was afraid for you too, more afraid than I have ever been for myself." They put the fire out together, the 3 of them, hauling water from the well until the last embers hissed into darkness, and by the time the sun rose gray and exhausted over the eastern ridge, the tool shed was a ruin but the house still stood, and all 3 of them were alive, and something had shifted permanently between Dorothy and Charles in the crucible of that long night, some final wall come down that neither of them had realized was still standing. "This has gone too far," Dorothy said, sitting on the porch steps as the sun climbed, too tired even to go inside and sleep. "Attempted murder, Charles, that is what this was, not a burned barn, not a called note. Men shooting at us in the dark. This is beyond anything the law in this territory can ignore, if only I can find a way to prove Crane's hand was behind it." "We saw 6 riders," Charles said. "Pete unhorsed 2 of them. Did you get a look at their faces?" "Dutch Hobbs," Pete said grimly, from where he sat cleaning his shotgun with slow, deliberate motions. "I know that man's build anywhere. He broke my jaw once in a bar fight in Cheyenne years back, before he ever worked for Crane." If Dutch Hobbs was riding with them, then Crane sent them, sure as the sun rises. "But proving it," Dorothy said, "proving it to a marshal, to a judge, that is another matter entirely. Crane has money enough to buy silence from most anyone in this territory." Charles was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun climb higher, and then he said, "Not everyone can be bought, Dorothy. And a land baron burning a woman's shed and shooting up her porch in the dead of night, that is the kind of thing that makes even bought men nervous, because it is the kind of thing that draws attention from Washington, from federal marshals, from newspapers that do not answer to Silas Crane. Men like Crane do not fear the law so much as they fear the law noticing them. Then perhaps, Dorothy said slowly, an idea taking shape in her exhausted mind, perhaps it is time the law noticed him. The plan they settled on over the following days was not without risk, but it was the only path Dorothy could see that did not end either in her selling the land or in someone she loved being killed in the dark. Larkspur's town marshal, a decent but overmatched man named Aaron Whitfield, had long suspected Crane's hand behind various misfortunes that befell those who crossed him, but had never been able to gather proof solid enough to act on, not with Crane's money greasing so many palms in the territory. What Dorothy needed, Charles argued, was not merely proof of the attack, but proof of the pattern behind it, proof that would reach beyond Larkspur to the territorial governor's office, or better still, to a federal marshal who owed Crane nothing at all. It was Otis the liveryman of all people, who provided the opening they needed. In the days after the attack, word spread through Larkspur of what had happened at the Bell Ranch, and though most of the town remained too cautious to speak openly against Crane, Otis came to Charles quietly one afternoon at the livery, glancing over his shoulder before he spoke. "There's a man been through town twice this summer," Otis said. "Federal Land Office Inspector out of Cheyenne, name of Marcus Whitlow. Come through asking quiet questions about irregular filings, water rights claims that don't square with the survey records. I did not think much of it at the time, but after what happened at your place, I got to thinking. Crane's been buying up water rights all over this county for 2 years now, more of them than a man his size ought to be able to afford, even with the bank behind him. If half of Larkspur is any judge, some of that money did not come by honest channels. Fraud, Charles said. Crane's committing fraud with the land office." "I would not say so outright," Otis said carefully, "on account of my own business surviving Crane's displeasure. But I would say a man looking into such things might find it worth his while to speak with Inspector Whitlow, should he ever come through Larkspur again." Charles rode to Cheyenne himself within the week, leaving Pete to watch over Dorothy and the ranch, and after 2 days of careful inquiry at the Territorial Land Office, he found Marcus Whitlow, a thin, precise man with spectacles and a manner that suggested he had spent a great many years being underestimated by louder men, and found him more than willing to listen. "Silas Crane has filed water rights claims on no fewer than 11 parcels in the Larkspur Basin over the past 2 years, Whitlow said, once Charles had laid out what he knew, several of which appear, on closer inspection of the survey plats, to overlap with existing homestead claims that were never properly extinguished. That is a significant irregularity, Mr. Abbott, the kind that suggests either gross incompetence at the county recorder's office or deliberate falsification. Combined with an account of armed men attacking a homestead in the night, I believe I have more than sufficient cause to open a formal federal inquiry." "How long would that take?" Charles asked. "Weeks, ordinarily. But arson and attempted murder committed against a woman defending her legal claim, that is the sort of detail that moves things a great deal faster, particularly if there are witnesses willing to testify, and particularly if the newspapers in Cheyenne take an interest, which I have little doubt they would." Whitlow studied Charles for a long moment. "You care for this woman a great deal, Mr. Abbott." "I do," Charles said simply. "Then I would advise you to return to her quickly, and to be ready, because when a man like Crane senses that the ground is shifting beneath him, he does not retreat quietly. He strikes once more, as hard as he is able before the walls close in." Charles rode back to Larkspur with Whitlow's warning heavy in his mind, and he did not stop except to rest his horse, arriving back at the Bell Ranch on the evening of the second day to find Dorothy waiting on the porch. And the sight of her, unharmed, safe, watching for his return, struck him with such force of feeling that he swung down from his horse before it had fully stopped and crossed the yard to her without a word, taking her into his arms right there in the fading light. "You found something," Dorothy said, reading it in his face. "I found a federal inspector who has been building a case against Crane for months without knowing it," Charles said. "Fraudulent water rights filings, homestead claims falsified or overlapped, enough irregularity to bring real trouble down on him, especially once he hears what happened here. But Dorothy, he warned me, and I believe him. Crane will not sit quiet and wait for the law to catch up to him. If he senses the ground shifting, he will move fast and hard one final time before it is too late for him to move at all." Dorothy's face had gone pale in the dusk light, but her jaw was set with the same iron resolve Charles had come to know so well. "Then we had best be ready for him," she said, "whatever form that takes." They did not have long to wait. Silas Crane learned of Inspector Whitlow's inquiry within 4 days, through one of the land office clerks he had long kept in his pocket, and the knowledge landed on him like a physical blow. He understood immediately what it meant: exposure, ruin, likely prison, everything he had built through 2 decades of ruthless acquisition unraveling, because a stubborn woman and her hired man had refused to be frightened off a single quarter section of grazing land. He sat alone in his study above the bank that evening, the lamp burning low, and made the decision that would end, one way or another, his long campaign against Dorothy Bell. He would not send Dutch Hobbs and a handful of riders this time. He would come himself, with every man still loyal enough to follow him into open lawlessness, and he would burn the Bell Ranch to the ground, house and all, and make certain there was no one left alive to testify against him, and he would be gone across the territorial line into Idaho before any marshal thought to look for him. It was a desperate plan, the plan of a man who has run out of patience and out of options, and it was for exactly that reason that it was also the most dangerous plan he had yet attempted. Word reached the Bell Ranch 2 nights later, not from any warning Crane intended to give, but from a stable boy in Crane's own employ, a 15-year-old orphan named Tobias, who had grown fond of the way Dorothy Bell always spoke kindly to him on her visits to town, unlike most who barely noticed a stable boy existed. Tobias overheard Crane and Dutch Hobbs discussing the night's plans in low, urgent voices, and slipped out of town on a borrowed horse to ride the 3 miles to the Bell Ranch as fast as the animal could carry him, arriving breathless and terrified just as the sun was setting. "Mr. Crane means to come tonight," Tobias gasped out once Charles had helped him down from the horse. "Him and 8 men, maybe more, all of them armed. He means to burn the house, Miss Bell," and he said the boy's voice caught, and he looked at Dorothy with wide, frightened eyes. "He said there was to be no one left to talk about it after." Dorothy went very still, and Charles saw the fear pass through her, quick and real, before something harder settled into its place. "Then we cannot fight this alone," Dorothy said. "Not 8 or more armed men, not against 3 of us and a boy. Charles, we must ride for Larkspur now and bring back Marshal Whitfield and every man in that town willing to stand against Crane once and for all." "That is a 3-mile ride each way," Charles said, already moving toward the horses. "We do not have that kind of time before dark." "Then we ride fast," Dorothy said, "and we pray the town has more courage in it than Crane has given them credit for." What happened next would be spoken of in Larkspur for years afterward, retold and embellished at gatherings and church socials until it took on the shape of legend, though the truth of it, Dorothy always maintained, needed no embellishing at all. She and Charles rode into town together as the last light faded from the sky, going first to Marshal Whitfield's small office, where Charles laid out what young Tobias had overheard while Dorothy, breathless and urgent, made her case directly to the marshal's face. "He means to kill us tonight, Marshal, to burn the house down with us in it, so that there will be no one left to speak against him once the federal inspector's inquiry comes to bear. You have suspected Crane's hand in every misfortune that has struck this county for 2 years and never had the proof to act. Well, here is your proof arriving before your very eyes tonight, if you will only come and see it for yourself." Whitfield, to his credit, did not hesitate long. He had been a decent man trapped by circumstance and lack of resources for 2 years, watching Crane's slow strangulation of the smaller ranches around Larkspur with a growing, helpless anger he had never known how to act upon, and Dorothy Bell's plain, urgent account gave him, at last, a cause he could move on without fear of overstepping his authority. "Attempted arson and murder in progress," Whitfield said, already reaching for his hat and his rifle. "That I can act on, proof or no proof, beyond what I see with my own eyes tonight. Miss Bell, Mr. Abbott, I will need every man willing to ride, and I will need them now." What Dorothy had not expected, riding through the darkened streets of Larkspur behind the marshal as he roused the town, was how many men proved willing. Otis, the liveryman, saddled his own horse without being asked twice. The blacksmith, a broad, quiet man named Ezra Cole, who had lost a lease to Crane's water rights maneuvering the previous year, took up his shotgun without a word. 2 of the smaller ranchers from outside town, men who had watched Dorothy hold her ground against Crane all summer and drawn a quiet courage from her example, saddled up as well, along with 3 more townsmen who had simply had enough, in their own quiet way, of watching one man hold an entire county hostage to his greed. By the time the party rode out from Larkspur, there were 11 men beside Marshal Whitfield, plus Charles and Dorothy themselves, riding hard through the deepening night toward the Bell Ranch, and Dorothy, riding beside Charles at a full gallop with the wind tearing at her hair and the stars beginning to show overhead, felt something rise in her chest that was not quite hope and not quite fear, but stood somewhere brave and trembling between the two. "We are not too late," she said, more to herself than to Charles, a kind of prayer spoken aloud. "We cannot be too late." They were not. They arrived at the Bell Ranch just as Crane's men were dismounting in the yard, torches already lit, Silas Crane himself sitting his horse at the edge of the firelight with an expression of cold, final purpose on his face, and the sudden thunder of a dozen more riders bursting out of the darkness threw his men into instant, disorganized confusion. "Silas Crane!" Marshal Whitfield's voice rang out across the yard, cutting through the chaos with the full authority of the law behind it. "You are under arrest for arson, attempted murder, and fraud against the United States Land Office. Drop your weapons, all of you, or answer to federal marshals within the week." For a long, suspended moment, nothing happened. Crane's men looked to their employer, waiting for some signal, some order that would tell them whether to fight or flee, and Crane himself sat frozen on his horse, the torchlight flickering across a face that had, for the first time in his long career of quiet ruthlessness, no answer prepared. It was Dutch Hobbs who broke first, throwing down his torch and raising his hands, and once the largest of Crane's men had surrendered, the rest followed in a ragged, shame-faced cascade, until only Crane himself remained astride his horse in the fire-lit yard, surrounded on all sides by armed men who had once feared him and now, quite suddenly, did not. "This is my land now, in all but paper," Crane said, though his voice had lost its old certainty. "You cannot arrest a man for defending his own investments. I can arrest a man for burning down a homestead with a woman and 2 men inside it," Whitfield said. "And I can arrest him besides for filing fraudulent claims with the Federal Land Office, which I am told a federal inspector out of Cheyenne is already prepared to testify to. Get down off that horse, Silas Crane, before I decide the paperwork can wait until after you've been shot resisting arrest." Crane dismounted slowly, and as he did, his eyes found Dorothy, standing beside Charles with her father's rifle still in her hands, unhurt, unbroken, Exactly as defiant as she had been the very first day, he had ridden onto her land with an offer she had refused before he'd even finished making it. "You'll never break me," Dorothy said quietly, the same words she had spoken to him months before, though now they carried the full weight of everything that had happened between then and now, every burned barn and threatened note and bullet fired in the dark. "I told you that the first time, Mr. Crane, and I meant it then same as I mean it now. You had your chance to try, and you failed, and there will not be a second chance, not ever." Crane said nothing, and there was nothing left for him to say. Marshal Whitfield and 2 of the townsmen led him away in irons, along with Dutch Hobbs and the others, to be held in the Larkspur jail until federal marshals could arrive from Cheyenne to take custody, and the fires his men had meant to set were put out before they had ever properly begun, and the Bell Ranch stood untouched beneath a sky full of quiet, indifferent stars, exactly as it had stood for 12 years, exactly as Dorothy intended it to stand for the rest of her life. The federal inquiry that followed moved swiftly once it had proper cause behind it. Inspector Whitlow arrived from Cheyenne within the week, and his investigation, combined with the sworn testimony of Marshal Whitfield, Dorothy Bell, Charles Abbott, and a dozen witnesses to the attempted attack, unraveled 2 years of fraudulent land dealings that had allowed Silas Crane to claim water rights across the county through falsified survey filings and outright bribery of county officials. Crane was tried in the territorial court in Cheyenne that autumn, convicted on charges of fraud, arson, and attempted murder, and sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison, his vast landholdings seized and eventually redistributed, much of the water rights restored to the very small ranchers he had spent years squeezing out. Dutch Hobbs and the other men who had ridden with him that final night received lesser sentences for their part in the attack, though Hobbs himself, upon reflection during his months awaiting trial, offered testimony against Crane that helped seal the case beyond any doubt. Larkspur, in the months that followed, became a different sort of town, freed at last from the long shadow Crane had cast over it. The bank changed hands, the mercantile's prices came back down to something reasonable, and the small ranchers and homesteaders who had lived for 2 years under the threat of Crane's slow economic strangulation found, for the first time, that they could plan for a future without wondering whether some new impossible demand might arrive at their door. For Dorothy Bell and Charles Abbott, the months following Crane's arrest brought a different kind of reckoning, quieter, and infinitely more welcome. It was on a warm evening in October, with the cottonwoods along Larkspur Creek turning gold and the first hint of autumn crispness in the evening air, that Charles asked Dorothy to walk with him up to the hill behind the house, where her parents lay buried beneath 2 simple wooden markers her father had carved himself years before for a neighbor's grave, and which Dorothy had replicated for her own family when the time came. "I wanted to ask you something," Charles said, once they had reached the top of the hill and stood looking out over the ranch spread below them, the house and the rebuilt barn and the corrals and the creek running silver in the last of the evening light. "And I thought it right to ask it here, with your parents as witness, since I know how much this land and everything on it means to you, and I would not want to ask you to share your life with me without first asking it in a place that honors where you came from." Dorothy's breath caught, and she turned to look at him fully, her eyes already bright with anticipation of what she hoped, desperately, he was about to say. "I have loved you, I think, since the night we pulled those horses out of the burning barn together," Charles said, "though I did not have the sense to know it for what it was until later. I have watched you stand against a man with more money and more power than any 10 men ought to have, and I have never once seen you break, not truly, not even when I know you were afraid down to your very bones. You are the strongest person I have ever known, Dorothy Bell, and I do not say that lightly, having served alongside soldiers in a war that tested every kind of strength a person can have. I would be honored, more than honored, if you would consent to be my wife, and to let me stand beside you on this land for whatever years we are given, through whatever storms may come. Dorothy did not answer right away, not because she was uncertain, but because the feeling rising in her chest was too large for words to hold at first, and she needed a moment simply to breathe through it. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears she did not try to hide. "I told Silas Crane once that I intended to die on this land an old woman surrounded by grandchildren," she said. "I did not know, when I said it, who those grandchildren's grandfather might be. But I know now, Charles Abbott, as certainly as I have ever known anything in my life. Yes, yes, I will marry you, and gladly, and I cannot imagine a single day of my life from this one forward that I would want to spend without you in it." He kissed her then, on the hill above her parents' graves, with the whole ranch spread golden and glowing below them in the last light of an October evening. And it was a kiss that held in it everything they had survived together, every fear faced and every fire fought, and every quiet evening on the porch that had, slowly and surely, built something neither of them had expected to find again after all they had separately lost. They were married in December of that year, in the small church in Larkspur, with Pete Ruiz standing as Charles's best man, weathered face beaming with a pride so fierce it brought tears to more than one eye in the small congregation, and Otis the liveryman and Marshall Whitfield and Ezra Cole, and all the others who had ridden out that terrible night to save the Bell Ranch gathered in the pews alongside them, along with young Tobias, whom Dorothy and Charles had by then taken on permanently at the ranch, giving the orphan boy a home and a trade, and a family that neither Crane nor circumstance could take from him. Dorothy wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered and pressed for the occasion, and Charles wore a new suit purchased with wages he had, for once, felt entirely comfortable spending on something other than survival. And when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the whole church erupted into an applause so warm and genuine that Dorothy laughed through her happy tears and thought, not for the first time, how strange and wonderful it was that a night that had begun in terror and fire had led, eventually, to a room full of people who loved her, and a man beside her who loved her more than she had ever thought to hope for. The years that followed were not without their hardships, as every life on the frontier carried its share of difficulty, but they were years built on a foundation strong enough to weather them. Charles took to ranching with the same steady determination he had brought to everything else in his life, and under his and Dorothy's combined stewardship, the Bell Ranch, which they came in time to simply call home, grew and prospered, its herds increasing year over year, its water rights secure and unthreatened now that the county's tangle of fraudulent claims had been sorted out by the federal courts. Their first child, a son, was born in the autumn of 1879, and they named him Thomas, after Dorothy's father, and Charles held the boy in his arms on the porch where, 18 months before, he had first met Dorothy in the chaos of a burning barn, and felt a peace so complete it nearly stopped his breath entirely. 2 years later came a daughter, whom they named Margaret after Charles's own mother, who had by then made the long journey west from St. Louis to see her son settled and happy, and who wept with joy to hold her first granddaughter, and to see, at last, that Charles had found in the Wyoming Territory everything the war and the railroad and the bank had once taken from him in Kansas. A third child followed some years later, another son they named Peter, in honor of the old ranch hand who had by then become as much a grandfather to their children as any blood relation could have been, and who lived out his remaining years on the Bell Ranch, still riding fence at 70 years old, with a stubbornness that Dorothy always claimed he had taught her long before Charles Abbott ever arrived to learn it for himself. Dorothy Bell Abbott, as she was known throughout the county for the remainder of her long life, never did sell so much as an acre of her father's land, and the ranch that Thomas Bell had built from raw prairie in 1866 grew, under Dorothy and Charles's combined care, into one of the most respected and prosperous cattle operations in that stretch of the Wyoming Territory, known as much for the fairness with which its owners dealt with their neighbors and their hired hands as for the quality of its herds. Silas Crane served his full 15 years in the territorial prison and emerged in 1893, a broken and forgotten man, his fortune long since seized and redistributed, his name spoken in Larkspur only as a cautionary tale about the dangers of greed unchecked, while the name of Dorothy Bell, and later Dorothy Abbott, was spoken with nothing but warmth and admiration for the rest of her days. On quiet evenings, when the work of the day was done and the children were grown or asleep, Dorothy and Charles would sometimes climb the hill behind the house to sit beside the graves of Dorothy's parents and watch the sun go down over the land they had fought so hard to keep. And Charles would take her hand, work-worn now, but no less strong than the day. He had first watched her aim a rifle at Silas Crane without a single tremor in her grip, and he would tell her, as he told her often through all their years together, that she was still the strongest, bravest, most extraordinary woman he had ever known, and Dorothy would lean her head against his shoulder and say that she had never once, in all the years since that first terrible fire, felt anything but safe and whole beside him, and that whatever the land or the world had once tried to take from either of them, they had built something together that no one, ever again, would have the power to break. And so the words Dorothy Bell had spoken on her porch that first spring morning, defiant and unshaking with a rifle in her hands, proved true not just for that single confrontation, but for the whole of her life that followed. She had never been broken, not by Silas Crane, not by grief, not by fear. And in Charles Abbott she had found not a man who tried to break her either, but one who had simply stood beside her, steady and unwavering, while she remained exactly as unbreakable as she had always known herself to be.